Bones break with a sound like snapping. Celery, Cassidy knew that sound. Intimately, her home world demanded. Dense skeletal structures, thick hide, and a complete absence of hesitation. For 5 years in the galactic rim, she was the undisputed apex predator in every room she entered. She was the solitary Deathworlder, untouchable, unbreakable. Then a scrawny, soft-looking biped named Arthur stumbled into the docking bay with a wrench in his hand and a complete disregard for the laws of physics. The floor of the Sector 4 transit hub was always sticky. It didn't matter how many times the automated scrubbers hummed over the grated steel. A permanent layer of grease spilled. Synthetic ethanol and industrial solvent clung to the deck plates. Cassidy felt it pulling at the soles of her heavy work boots with every step. She hated this station. She hated the low gravity. Station 44 was calibrated to galactic standard 8GS, a gentle floating pole designed to accommodate the frail, hollow bone species that made up 90% of civilized space. For them, it was comfortable. For Cassidy, it was a waking nightmare of restraint. Moving through the corridors felt like wading through deep, lukewarm water. Snorts if she pushed off a wall too hard, she dented the bulkheads. If she grabbed a handrail to steady herself, the metal warped under her grip. She lived in a galaxy made of glass, and she was terribly, painfully tired of tiptoeing. Cassidy leaned against a reinforced structural pillar in the loading bay, a half-empty pouch of protein slurry in her left hand. The air tasted of ozone and oxidized copper, the sharp metallic tang of starships venting their exhaust too close to the atmospheric shields. She chewed the paste slowly. It tasted like damp cardboard, but it gave her the 6,000 calories a day her dense, heavy gravity musculature required just to maintain baseline function. Cassidy. The voice came from the ground level. Thin and ready, she looked down. Cole, her shift foreman, was gesturing sharply with a data pad. Cole was a native of some oceanic garden world. He had pale, translucent skin that bruised if you looked at it too hard, and large, wet eyes that always seemed on the verge of weeping. "We have a bottleneck on Bay 7, Cole said, his voice vibrating with a permanent low-level anxiety. "The automated lifters are offline. Motor burnout. We need manual clearance." Cassidy didn't say anything. She just crushed the empty protein pouch in her fist, feeling the cheap plastic polymer snap into jagged fragments, and tossed it into a nearby incinerator chute. "Heavy crates?" she asked. "Industrial machinery," Cole said, wincing slightly as a nearby cargo transport blew its horn. 3 tons each. You'll need to rig the auxiliary pulleys. It will take hours. Cassidy dropped down from the catwalk. It was a 20 FT fall. For a standard galactic citizen, it would have shattered their femurs and ruptured their spinal columns. Cassidy hit the grated floor with a heavy, deafening thud. The steel plates groaned in protest. She bent her knees slightly to absorb the kinetic energy, then straightened up. Cole took a reflexive step back, his pale throat working in a hard swallow. "I won't need the pulleys," Cassidy said. She walked toward Bay 7, her boots slamming against the deck. She didn't swagger, she didn't posture. There was no need. Gravity was her birthright, her curse and her armor. Her home world was a brutal rock of hyperstorms, tectonic instability, and 2.4 GS of crushing atmospheric pressure. Evolution there hadn't bothered with. Elegance, it had built living tanks. When she reached the bottleneck, a small crowd of dock workers had already gathered, standing safely behind the yellow hazard lines. They murmured and clicked in their native tongues, staring at the stalled magnetic lifter and the massive gunmetal gray crates blocking the primary airlock. Cassidy stepped up to the nearest crate, the warning stencils on the side read 3.2 metric tons. Danger, do not lift unassisted. She wedged her thick fingers under the grooved edge of the crate. The metal was freezing cold, rhymed with the frost of deep space. She took a breath, the air hissed through her teeth. She planted her boots, feeling the deck plates shift under her weight, and drove upward. Her muscles coiled like thick steel cables. The crate shrieked against the floor, a horrible high-pitched scream of metal on metal. Cassidy ignored the noise. She felt the strain in her lower back, dull, familiar heat that told her she was finally actually working. She heaved the massive block of iron and circuitry off the ground, pivoting on one heel, and slammed it down onto the adjacent conveyor belt. The entire bay shook. A cloud of fine dust rained down from the ceiling rafters. The gathered crowd of workers flinched, some throwing their hands over their auditory canals, backing away in sheer instinctual terror. Cassidy wiped a smear of industrial grease from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She wasn't even breathing hard. She looked at the terrified workers. They looked back at her like she was a monster, an aberration. She turned back to the remaining crates. The loneliness settled into her chest, cold and heavy, much heavier than the iron she was moving. She was the only one of her kind out here, the only thing that couldn't be broken. It was a profoundly isolating absolute. The shift changed at 400 hours. The artificial lights in the loading bay dimmed from a harsh clinical white to a softer, bruised purple to simulate a planetary evening. Cassidy sat on an overturned chemical drum, staring at the scarred palms of her hands. Hey, past the hydro spanner. The voice was grating, flat, unapologetic. Cassidy looked up. Standing near the open chassis of a fuel transport was the new hire. Cole had introduced him yesterday. His name was Arthur. Arthur did not look like he belonged on a heavy freighter dock. He looked like he belonged behind a desk, or perhaps in a gentle agricultural colony. He was bipedal, but entirely lacking in defensive biology. He had no exoskeleton, no scales, no fur to insulate him from the temperature fluctuations. His skin was a soft, pale, pinkish tan, marred only by faint dark hairs and a smattering of fading purple bruises. He was wearing a grease-stained canvas jacket and chewing rhythmically on a small white plastic stick. Cassidy picked up the heavy tungsten tool and tossed it to him. She intentionally threw it slightly too fast. A casual test. Arthur didn't flinch. He reached out with one hand and caught the heavy metal wrench midair. The sharp smack of metal hitting his soft palm echoed in the quiet bay. He didn't rub his hand. He didn't complain. He just slid under the transport vehicle and started working. Cassidy frowned. She could smell him from across the bay. Unlike the antiseptic, chemically neutralized odors of the other aliens, Arthur smelled distinctly biological. He smelled of salt, old sweat, and something acidic like black coffee. He breathed loudly, his respiratory system pushing air in and out in a constant, inefficient rhythm. You're Stripping the bolts, Cassidy said, her voice a low rumble. Arthur slid out from under the transport. His face was streaked with black oil. He wiped his forehead with the back of a filthy sleeve, smearing the grease further. Bolts were already stripped, Arthur said. Cheap zinc alloy. Some idiot torqued them down with a pneumatic driver instead of doing it by hand. He didn't sound intimidated. He sounded annoyed. Before Cassidy could reply, a deep structural groan vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the usual hum of the station's engines. It was the sharp, agonizing sound of failing tensile steel. Cassidy's head snapped up. Above them, suspended by a massive overhead magnetic crane, was a shipping container of raw, unrefined plasto. The warning klaxons hadn't sounded yet. The safety interlocks were green, but Cassidy's ears evolved for detecting the microscopic shifts in tectonic plates. Heard the snort's microscopic tear of the magnetic housing cracking. Move, Cassidy barked. Arthur looked up. The housing snapped. It wasn't a slow cinematic fall. 3 tons of compressed plasto dropped like a stone. Arthur was directly underneath it. Cassidy lunged forward, her boots tearing the metal grating from the floor, but she was 30 ft away. She couldn't make it. She braced herself for the inevitable sickening sound. Snorts. The sound of soft tissue turning to liquid, the sound of a frail skeleton being pulverized into dust. She hated that sound. The container hit the deck with a concussive boom that blew out the nearest light fixtures. Shrapnel and dust exploded outward in a blinding gray cloud. The deck plates buckled downward, forming a massive, jagged crater. Cassidy skidded to a halt at the edge of the impact zone. The air was thick with the smell of vaporized metal and pulverized concrete. Arthur, she said, it wasn't a question. It was a statement of a casualty. Son of an NBSP and NBSP, the voice came from beneath the dust. It was strained, breathless, and incredibly pissed off. Cassidy froze. The dust began to settle. Arthur was not paced, he was pinned beneath the edge of the container. The massive steel box had crushed the rear axle of the transport vehicle, which had arrested some of the momentum, but the corner of the container rested directly across Arthur's chest and left shoulder. Cassidy stepped forward, her mind failing to process the visual input. By all known biological metrics of standard gravity species, Arthur's rib cage should have collapsed, puncturing his organs and causing immediate, catastrophic hemorrhaging. Arthur's face was beet red. The veins in his neck stood out like thick cords. He was sweating profusely, the salt water stinging his eyes. His teeth were bared, biting down on the plastic stick so hard it had snapped in half. He wasn't just surviving the weight. He had his right arm wedged against the floor, his left hand pressed against the underside of the 3-ton container. He was pushing back. Don't just stand there, you overgrown rock, Arthur ground out, blood seeping from his left nostril. Little help, my collarbone is screaming. Cassidy snapped out of her paralysis. She grabbed the edge of the container, her heavy muscles flexing as she hauled the mass of metal upward. Arthur let out a sharp, ragged breath, scrambled backward out of the impact zone, and collapsed onto the grating. Cassidy let the container drop. She stared at Arthur. He was sitting up. He was alive. He spat a mouthful of metallic tasting saliva onto the floor. He rolled his left shoulder, a sharp audible pop Echoed in the bay, Arthur winced. Rubbing the joint, damn it, Arthur. Muttered, that's going to bruise. Cassidy stepped closer, looming over him. You shouldn't be alive, Arthur. Looked up at her, wiping the blood from his nose with his thumb. Yeah, well, gravity is a suggestion. Where I come from, you got a medical kit. I think I need a painkiller and a stiff drink. Cassidy felt a strange, terrifying shudder run down her spine. It wasn't fear, it was the sudden, earth-shattering realization that the glass galaxy held something else. Something that didn't break. The infirmary on Station 44 was a sterile, brightly lit nightmare of white enamel and humming diagnostic machines. It smelled sharply of synthetic iodine and ozone. Bennett, the station's chief medical officer, looked like an upright mantis with a severe anxiety disorder. His long, multi-jointed fingers danced over the holographic display of the diagnostic bed where Arthur was currently sitting. Arthur had refused to lie down. He sat on the edge of the examination table, his heavy canvas jacket discarded on a nearby chair. Beneath it, he wore a simple gray thermal shirt, now torn at the shoulder, revealing skin that was already turning a deep, angry shade of purple and black. Cassidy stood in the doorway. She blocked the exit entirely, her broad shoulders nearly touching the frame. She hadn't left Arthur's side since the docking bay. She couldn't. Her brain demanded an explanation for the physical impossibility she had witnessed. This is incorrect. The sensors are malfunctioning. Bennett clicked, his mandibles twitching as he tapped the side of his diagnostic scanner. Sensors are fine, Doc, Arthur said, reaching over to grab a sterile gauze pad. He pressed it to his bloody nose. It's just a hairline fracture in the clavicle. Wrap it up and clear me for duty. A hairline fracture. Bennett's voice rose to a shrill squeak. You sustained a kinetic impact of over 12,000 newtons. Your skeletal structure should be powder. Snorts. Your internal organs should be liquefied. Bennett rotated the holographic X-ray. Cassidy narrowed her eyes, stepping closer to look at the projection. It was a skeleton, but it was wrong. It wasn't the hollow honeycomb lattice of the avid species, nor the brittle cartilage of the aquatics. The bones projected in the hologram were thick, dense, packed tightly with calcium and phosphorus, and layered over those bones was a terrifying network of tightly wound muscle fibers, incredibly snorts, dense, woven together like industrial cabling. Your bone density is absurd, Bennett whispered, horrified. Your muscle tissue is. It's entirely disproportionate to your mass and your cardiovascular system. Your heart is pumping a volume of fluid that would rupture a standard vascular wall. We like our blood pressure high, Arthur muttered, looking bored. Look, wrap the shoulder. Give me some ibuprofen and let me out of here. I have a shift to finish. Cassidy finally spoke. Her voice was low, resonating in the small room like distant thunder. What are you? Arthur looked at her. Really looked at her. He dropped the bloody gauze pad into a bow waste bin. I told you, Arthur said. I'm a mechanic. You are not standard, Cassidy said, stepping fully into the room. Floor plates groaned under her weight. You have no natural armor. Your skin is soft. A piece of sharp metal can cut you. I saw you bleed, but you took a crushing force that would have killed a mature Typhonian. Yeah, well, Typhonians got thick skin, but they don't got shock absorbers, Arthur said, leaning back on His good arm, my skeleton flexes. My muscles absorb kinetic impact, and when things go really bad, my adrenal glands dump a chemical cocktail into my brain that basically turns off my pain receptors and lets me lift cars. Cars, Bennett asked, confused. Heavy. Transports, Arthur translated, waving his hand dismissively. Cassidy stared at him. She looked at his soft pink skin. It was a lie. The softness was a trick. A biological camouflage. Beneath the soft, fragile exterior was an internal architecture built for pure, unadulterated survival. Where is your home world? Cassidy demanded. Earth. Arthur said. He said it casually, like it was a mundane piece of trivia. Bennett dropped his scanner. It clattered loudly against the floor. Earth, that system is locked. It's a Class 9 death world. It has volatile tectonic plates, predatory flora, localized hyperstorms, and microorganisms that consume flesh. It's uninhabitable for you. Maybe, Arthur said, sliding off the examination table. He didn't even WSC as his boots hit the floor. For snorts us, it's just home. We complain about the weather, we pay our taxes, and we try not to get eaten by the local wildlife. Cassidy felt a strange sensation in her chest. For 5 years she had carried the burden of being the only solid thing in a fragile universe. She had walked with the heavy, cynical exhaustion of someone who knows they are alone at the top of the food chain. She looked at Arthur. He was smaller than her. He was softer than her. He looked entirely unimpressive. But underneath that stained shirt was a skeleton forged in a gravity well just as brutal as her own, snorts powered by a heart that refused to stop beating, even when crushed under 3 tons of steel. You're soft on the outside, Cassidy said quietly. Arthur grabbed his canvas jacket, throwing it carefully over an injured shoulder. He walked past Cassidy, stopping just at the door frame. He looked up at her, a cynical, tired smile playing on his lips. The universe is full of hard things that shatter, Cassidy, Arthur said, his voice dropping the casual mechanic routine. For just a second, Earth didn't teach us how to be hard. It taught us how to take a hit, bleed a little, and get back up. We don't shatter. He patted her heavy, dense arm, a casual gesture that would have terrified any other species on the station. See you on the dock. We still have cargo to move. Cassidy watched him walk down the corridor. He was limping slightly. He was bruised. He was bleeding, but he wasn't broken. For the first time in 5 years, Cassidy smiled, a slow, terrifying expression that bared her teeth. She wasn't alone anymore. Administration Level 3 smelled of synthetic lavender and suppressed panic. Director Rick sat behind a desk constructed of spun glass composite, a material so delicate that Cassidy could have crushed it to powder. Between her thumb and forefinger, Rick's belonged to high canopy aerial species. He was tall, painfully thin, and covered in a layer of iridescent blue feathers that were currently puffed out in a biological display of extreme distress. He kept adjusting the collar of his uniform, his long, delicate talons clicking nervously against the glass desk. Cassidy stood on the left side of the room, intentionally taking up as much space as possible. She didn't sit. The snorts chairs provided were flimsy, ergonomic webs designed for hollow bones. She preferred the solid deck beneath her boots, even if the gravity up here was dialed down to a nauseating 0.6 gs. It made her stomach float. Arthur sat on the right. He had taken a chair. It groaned ominously every time he breathed, the carbon fiber frame bowing under the dense concentration of human muscle and bone. He was slouched, his canvas jacket zipped up to his chin, his left arm held stiffly against his ribs. He was loudly crunching on something that smelled sharply of synthetic peppermint. I don't think you understand the severity of this situation, Rick said. His voice was a melodious, high-pitched warble, translated by a discreet earpiece into standard galactic. This is a logistical nightmare. Rix tapped a primary keystroke on his console. A holographic projection materialized the center of the room. Its snorts displayed a sterile bulleted list, floating in crisp amber text. Incident report, Doc 7 structural and personnel assessment, infraction 1A. Unauthorized manual lifting of class 4. Heavy machinery. Infraction 4C, catastrophic failure of overhead magnetic gantry. Maintenance. Neglected by previous shift, damage. Tally, 3 reinforced deck plates. Buckled, cratered. 1 cargo transport axle pulverized. 6 structural support struts, micro fractures detected, medical anomaly. Report. Biological entity. Arthur survived a 12,000 Newton kinetic impact with non-lethal tissue damage. Biological entity, Cassidy registered. Stress exertion levels capable of tearing standard industrial cabling. The structural damage is coming out of my operational budget, Rick squawked, his feathers ruffling violently. But that is not my primary concern. My concern is that I now have 2 Class 9 Deathers operating in a Class 2 commercial transit hub. The insurance premiums alone will bankrupt this sector, the Crane failed director. Arthur said. He sounded exhausted. He shifted in his seat and the chair let out a sharp dying crack. Arthur ignored it. If Cassidy hadn't been there, and if I wasn't made of stubborn dirt and calcium, you'd be scraping me off the deck plates with a spatula. You should be thanking us. Thanking you. RX's eyes, large and completely black, widened. You are hazards, both of you. The station's atmospheric pressure, the gravity plating, the ambient temperature, none of it is calibrated to contain entities of your biological density. You are localized gravity wells of destruction. Look at my floor. Cassidy looked down where she was standing. The polished polymer floor was faintly indented in the exact shape of her work boots. She shifted her weight, and the polymer wed. I've been working here 5 years, Rix, Cassidy said, her voice a deep rumble that vibrated the glass desk. I haven't broken anything I wasn't paid to break. You were an approved anomaly, RX countered, pointing a trembling talon at her. Your home world's application took 4 standard cycles to clear bureaucratic safety boards. You have a dedicated reinforced bunk. You have a specialized caloric quadota. And now Rick turned his terrified gaze to Arthur. Now I have an unregistered, unclassified biped from a locked system sitting in my office, bleeding onto my upholstery. Arthur glanced down. The wound on his shoulder had seeped through the cheap medical gauze, leaving a faint rust-cold stain on the gray fabric of the chair. My bad, Arthur mumbled. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, crumpled foil packet and popped 2 more white pills into his mouth. Swallowing them dry, I'll spray some enzyme cleaner on it. What are you ingesting? Rix demanded, his voice bordering on hysteria. Is that a combat stimulant? It's ibuprofen, Arthur said, rubbing his eyes. It reduces swelling. Look, Director, I'm a mechanic. I fix things. Your station is a rotting rust bucket holding itself together with cheap tape and prayers. Your magnetic lifters are burning out because your engineering staff is too weak to manually torque the primary housing bolts. I can torque them. Cassidy can move the crates so I can get to them. We're an asset. Rick stared at them. He looked from the massive, immovable wall of muscle that was Cassidy to the slumped, bruised, heavily bleeding biped that simply refused to die. The contradiction was breaking his administrative brain. Protocol dictates I isolate you both in a reinforced holding sector pending a full biological review by the Galactic Medical Board, Rix whispered, rubbing his temples. Cassidy crossed her arms. Her biceps flexed against her heavy canvas shirt. Who's going to put us there? The silence in the office was deafening. RX's gaze darted to the two-station security guards stationed outside the glass doors. They were insectoid armed with non-lethal stun batons and looked entirely ready to resign if ordered to engage. Rix exhaled a long defeat breath. Sector 4, he said finally. You are restricted to the heavy loading bays and the sublevel maintenance shafts. You will not enter the residential gardens. You will not use the civilian transit tubes, and for the love of the ancestors, do not touch anything in the atmospheric regulation centers. Will be gentle, Arthur said, standing up. The chair squeaked a final sigh of relief. Cassidy didn't say a word. She just turned and walked out, the heavy thud of her boots echoing down the sterile corridor, a rhythmic reminder of a reality the station administrators preferred to ignore. Working with Arthur was a study in profound, irritating contradictions. Cassidy watched him from the elevated gantry of Bay 9. He was buried waist deep in the access hatch of a malfunctioning thermal regulator. The air around the machine was a blistering 45 degrees C. For the aquatic dock workers, exposure to this heat would cause their skin to blister and crack within minutes. They had cordoned off the area with flashing yellow warning tape. Arthur had simply ducked under the tape, peeled off his jacket, and gone to work in his sweat stained undershirt. He was incredibly messy. His biological inefficiency baffled Cassidy. As he worked, his body constantly leaked water to regulate its internal temperature. The sweat dripped from his forehead, stinging his eyes and matting his dark hair to his skull. He swore frequently. Every time his wrench slipped, barking his knuckles against the jagged edges of the access panel, snorts, he would unleash a string of colorful, deeply anatomical earth profanities. He bled easily. The skin on his hands was already cross-hatched with dozens of tiny shallow lacerations from sharp metal burrs. But the blood didn't stop him. It just coagulated, dried, and mixed with the industrial grease, forming a stubborn, dirty crust over his knuckles. He was fragile, yet completely oblivious to his own fragility. Hand me the flux welder, Arthur called out, not looking up from the tangled mess of copper wiring. Cassidy dropped down from the gantry, hitting the deck with her usual heavy impact. She picked up the heavy torch and held it out. Arthur reached blindly behind him, grabbed the heated barrel of the torch instead of the insulated grip, and hissed sharply as his palm seared against the metal. He dropped it Instantly, it clattered against the grate. Son of Arthur yanked his hand, back shaking it violently, a bright red welt was already forming across his palm. Cassidy stared at him. Your thermal receptors are slow. I was distracted, Arthur muttered, grabbing a dirty rag from his back pocket and wrapping it tightly around his burned hand. Snorts. He didn't ask to go to the infirmary. He didn't panic. He just tied the knot with his teeth, picked up the welder by the correct handle, and turned back to the machinery. Hold this panel open for me. It's warped. Keep snapping shut. Cassidy stepped closer, the heat radiating from the regulator felt like a warm summer breeze on her home world. She grabbed the heavy plastol access panel, which was currently trying to slide shut on its pneumatic tracks, and held it open with one hand. It required snorts about 200 lb of continuous resistance. She didn't even flex. You humans, Cassidy said slowly, watching him solder a frayed wire, the bright blue sparks bouncing harmlessly off his sweat slicked arms. You are poorly designed, Arthur snorted. Thanks, you're a real poet. Cass, I am stating a biological fact. She continued. Your epidermis offers zero resistance to thermal or kinetic damage. Your sensory reflexes are sluggish. You require constant hydration. You possess no redundant organs. By galactic metrics, you are prey. Arthur finished the weld, cut the torch, and wiped his forehead with the back of his unburned wrist. He leaned against the humming machinery, looking up at her, his eyes dark and bloodshot held a strange, cynical amusement. You're right, Arthur said. If you drop a human into a cage with a Typhonian razor hound, the human dies. If you drop us in hard vacuum, we pop, we freeze, we burn, we bleed. We're soft. He reached into his tool bag and pulled out a battered metal thermos. He unscrewed the cap and took a long swig of whatever dark, bitter-smelling liquid was inside. But you're looking at it wrong, he said, capping the thermos. Earth didn't invest points into armor. It invested entirely into shock absorption and sheer idiotic stubbornness. Our bodies are constantly breaking down. The trick is we heal fast. You break a bone on a bird, guy up in administration. He's in a cast for 2 years. I snap my collarbone. I'm miserable for a month. It calcifies thicker than it was before. And I go back to work. Cassidy thought about the heavy, dense ache in her own bones. On her home world, you didn't get injured if you took a hit strong enough to break your dense skeleton. You were already dead. Healing wasn't a biological priority. Absolute structural integrity was. You were perfect until you shattered. Arthur wasn't perfect. He was a patchwork of scars, bruises, burns, and poorly healed fractures. He was a walking compromise. You endure, Cassidy observed. We outlast, Arthur corrected. We chased prey on Earth by just walking after it until it died of exhaustion. We didn't need to be faster or stronger. We just needed to not stop. It's an ugly way to live, but it gets the job done. He tapped his wrench against the side of the thermal regulator. The machine hummed steadily, the red warning lights flickering over to a stable green. Speaking of getting the job done, this relic is stabilized. Let's go get some food. The cafeteria here serves something that tastes almost exactly like wet cardboard, and I'm starving. Cassidy let the heavy blast shut. It slammed with a metallic crash that echoed through the empty bay. She walked beside him as they headed Toward the concourse, their footsteps fell into an uneven rhythm, Cassid's heavy measured thuds, Arthur's slightly uneven limping gait. She smelled the sharp tang of his sweat, and the bitter coffee radiating from him. It wasn't the sterile, odorless perfection of the rest of the station. It was messy, it was alive. For the first time in her life, Cassidy didn't feel the need to suppress her own weight. If she stepped too hard in the floor, groaned, Arthur didn't flinch. If she bumped her shoulder against a bulkhead and dented the metal, Arthur just chuckled. He didn't look at her like a monster, he looked at her like a coworker. It was an entirely new, entirely grounding sensation. She was a weapon of mass destruction. He was a walking disaster. They made a good team. The silence of a space station is never absolute. It is a symphony of low-frequency hums, the life support scrubbing the air, the massive fusion drives vibrating the deck plates, the distant rush of water through the hydroponic veins. Cassidy knew the baseline rhythm of Station 44 perfectly. When the rhythm broke, she felt it in her teeth. They were sitting in the sub-level cafeteria at 1,800 hours. Arthur was violently stabbing synthetic nutrient block with a plastic fork, complaining about the texture. It's like chewing on an acoustic ceiling tile, he grumbled, taking bite and grimacing. I would kill a man for a decent hamburger, just one. Dripping with grease, Cassidy was drinking her protein slurry. She paused. The liquid in her pouch vibrated, then the deck plates beneath their boots lurched. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was an explosive decompression shock wave. 3 seconds later, the primary lighting died, plunging the cafeteria into pitch darkness. The emergency backup generators slammed online with a deafening metallic clunk, bathing the room in a harsh, pulsing red glare. The klaxon started. They weren't the rhythmic warning beeps of a broken crane. This was a continuous, ear-splitting shriek, the alpha level hazard alarm. Attention all personnel. A sterile, automated voice blared over the comms, devoid of RX's earlier panic. Catastrophic rupture detected in primary coolant lines. Sector 4 Sub B toxic. Atmospheric venting in progress. Ambient temperature dropping at critical velocity. Evacuate immediately. Seeing bulkheads in 2 minutes, panic erupted. The cafeteria filled mostly with light industrial workers and mid-level technicians dissolved into chaos. Snorts, chairs clattered to the floor. Soft, fragile bodies scrambled toward the primary exits, their varied voices raised in clicks, chirps, and screams of terror. Arthur dropped his fork. The exhaustion instantly vanished from his posture. The slouch disappeared, his pupils dilated, the adrenaline spike hitting his system with visible force. Sub B, Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. Dead serious? That's right below the main fusion reactor. If the primary coolant lines sever completely, the reactor core will overheat, Cassidy said, standing up. Table groaned as she pushed off it. The station will vaporize. Automated emergency seals should isolate the rupture, Arthur said, grabbing his tool bag. The station administration defunds maintenance. The pneumatic seals in Sub B have been rusted open for a year. Cassidy stated the fact coldly. I reported it. Cole ignored it. Arthur swore loudly. He shoved his way through the panicked crowd, not bothering to be gentle anymore. His shoulders, thick and hard, bumped a delicate Avon worker, sending them spinning, but Arthur didn't stop to apologize. We need to manually close the primary flow valves before the Sub-Zero coolant freezes the core pumps. Arthur yelled over the sirens, breaking into a sprint. Cassidy followed. She didn't sprint, she moved with a terrifying locomotive momentum, taking long, heavy strides that ate up the distance. The crowd parted around her like water. Hitting a boulder, they reached the access stairwell to Subble B. 2 insected security guards were standing at the top, their mandibles clicking rapidly as they tried to lock the heavy blast doors snorts, effectively sealing the lower deck to die. Hold the door, Arthur shouted, skidding to a halt. Sector compromised, the guard clicked, its uniform shivering. Lethal. Atmospheric toxicity, core temperature degree C, survival probability 0. Securing blast door, the heavy steel door began to slide shut. Cassidy didn't slow down. She dropped her shoulder and hit the closing door with the force of a runaway freight train. The kinetic impact rang like a struck bell. The massive steel gears inside the door frame screamed, violently stripping their teeth. The door buckled, shuddered, and halted, stuck halfway open in its tracks. The guards backed away in sheer terror. Cassidy turned to Arthur. Go, Arthur. Slip through the gap. Cassidy squeezed her massive frame through. Immediately after, the air on the other side hit them like a physical blow. It was a nightmare of sensory overload. The Subble was filled with a dense, rolling fog of vaporized ammonia and hyperchilled liquid nitrogen. The temperature was plummeting rapidly. Frost was already crystallizing on the metal-grated floor and the overhead pipes. The smell was sharp, chemical, and completely sterile, the smell of frozen death. Arthur immediately started coughing, pulling his dirty rag from his pocket and tying it over his nose and mouth. It was a pathetic, almost comical defense against industrial chemicals. But he didn't hesitate. He pulled a heavy plasma torch from his bag and waded into the fog. The primary valve is at the end of the core, Arthur yelled, his voice muffled. Follow the main yellow pipe. Cassidy moved forward. The cold was intense, biting at her exposed skin, but her dense musculature generated a massive amount of internal heat. Her metabolism kicked into overdrive, her heart pounding a slow, heavy drum beat in her chest. For snorts her, it was profoundly uncomfortable. For Arthur, it was lethal. Cassidy watched him push through the fog. His breathing was already sounding ragged, the freezing air burning his soft lungs. His skin, visible at his wrists and neck, was turning a terrifying shade of pale blue. He was shivering violently, his body expending massive amounts of energy just to keep his core temperature from flatlining. Yet he kept moving. His boots crunched on the frost-covered grating. He wasn't stopping. He was acting on pure, irrational biological defiance. They reached the end of the corridor. The source of the rupture was obvious. Massive 3FFT thick steel pipe had sheared cleanly at a rusted joint. A geyser of sub-zero pale blue liquid was blasting against the far wall, immediately vaporizing into the dense fog. Beside the rupture was the manual shut off wheel. It was a massive iron circle, crusted heavily in white frost. Arthur reached it first. He grabbed the frozen iron with his bare hands. The skin of his palms instantly stuck to the sub-zero metal, freezing to the surface. He let out a muffled grunt of pain. Threw his rag, planted his boots on the slick floor, and threw his entire body weight into turning the wheel. The wheel didn't budge. The internal threading was frozen solid. Arthur's boots slipped. He slammed hard against the icy floor, his hands tearing free of the wheel, leaving bloody frozen strips of skin attached to the iron. He didn't scream, he just rolled over, gasping for air, clutching his bleeding, frostbitten hands to his chest. The human body had limits, and the ambient temperature of -80 was rapidly shutting his systems down. Cassidy stepped over him. She looked at the frozen wheel. She didn't bother trying to turn it. She didn't have the leverage, and the internal mechanisms were likely fused. She looked at the sheared pipe. The gap was about 6 in wide. The pressure of the escaping coolant was deafening, a localized hurricane of freezing death. Cassidy closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She took a deep breath, filling her massive lungs with the burning chemical air. Then she stepped directly into the geyser. The cold was absolute. It felt like a million tiny needles driving into her flesh, her thick hide immediately crusted with ice, but underneath the hide her dense muscle fibers contracted, holding firm. She jammed her massive, heavy hands directly into the gap of the sheared pipe. Cassidy, no. Arthur croaked from the floor, his voice barely a whisper. You'll freeze. Cassidy ignored him. She locked her elbows, braced her boots against the grooved grating, and gripped the two ends of the massive steel pipe. She roared, snorts. It wasn't a sound of pain, it was a sound of pure, unadulterated, tectonic exertion. The muscles in her back, thick as bridge cables, bulged against her heavy canvas shirt. The fabric tore open. She pulled. Steel pipe groaned. The sound vibrated over the deafening hiss of the coolant. She was fighting thousands of pounds of internal pressure and frozen rigid metal. She felt a capillary burst in her left eye. The world tinted red. The cold was seeping into her bones now, a dull, heavy ache that threatened to lock her joints. We outlast. Arthur's voice echoed in her head. Cassidy ground her teeth together. She pulled harder with a horrific screech of bending metal. The two ends of the 3FFT thick steel pipe moved. She pulled them together, forcing the jagged, sheared edges to interlock. The geyser of freezing coolant instantly choked off to a thin, sputtering hiss. Cassidy stood there, effectively acting as a living structural clamp, holding tons of pressurized metal together through sheer, impossible brute force. Her body was coated in a thick layer of frost. She looked like a statue carved from ice. She turned her head slowly, the ice cracking on her neck. She looked down at Arthur. He was huddled on the floor, shivering violently, his lips blue, but his dark eyes were wide and fixed on her. Weld it, Cassidy grunted, her voice a low, mechanical, grinding sound. Arthur didn't hesitate. He forced himself up onto his knees. His hands were bleeding and frostbitten, shaking uncontrollably. But he grabbed the heavy plasma torch from the floor. He ignited it. The bright blue flame cut through the freezing fog. He crawled forward. He braced himself against Cassidy's frozen leg for stability, leveled the torch at the seam between her massive hands, and pulled the trigger. The heat of the plasma washed over Cassidy's frozen knuckles. It burned terribly, a searing agony contrasting with the absolute cold. But she didn't flinch. She didn't drop the pipe. Arthur dragged the torch along The seam, his teeth chattering so hard. They sounded like a jackhammer. He was melting the steel, fusing the two jagged ends together, sealing the breach. For 3 agonizing minutes, they existed in perfect, brutal synergy. The unbreakable wall holding back the pressure and the soft, stubborn mechanic, refusing to freeze to death while he stitched the metal shut. Finally, Arthur killed the torch. The seam glowed a dull cherry red. Effectively welded, Cassidy slowly, carefully released her grip. The pipe held. She took a step back. Her legs felt heavy, sluggish, the cold deeply entrenched in her muscle tissue. She looked down at her hands. They were blistered from the plasma, encrusted in ice. She looked at Arthur. He had collapsed completely onto the grating, curled into a tight fetal position, his body shuddering violently as hypothermia set in. Cassidy bent down. The joints in her knees popped like gunfire. She scooped Arthur up in her arms. He felt incredibly light, incredibly fragile, a small soft thing wrapped in a dirty jacket. She clutched him to her chest, her own massive body heat slowly beginning to thaw him, and began the heavy, slow walk back toward the blasted open blast door. They had survived. Not through elegance, not through advanced technology, but through the messy, brutal application of dense bones and stubborn blood. The infirmary smelled like burning hair and sterilized copper. It was an offensive chemical odor that hung heavy in the air, a direct byproduct of the rapid thaw. Thermal blankets draped over Arthur's trembling frame. He was curled on his side on the primary diagnostic bed. The violent full body shivers had subsided into a low, continuous tremor. His skin had transitioned from a corpse-like blue to an angry mottled red as the capillaries rapidly dilated, snorts forcing warm blood back into his half-frozen extremities. He looked miserable. Cassidy sat on a reinforced steel stool across from him. Her hands rested, palms up on her knees. The thick gray hide of her knuckles was blistered and weeping a pale viscous fluid. The plasma torch had scorched through the first 3 layers of her epidermis, leaving behind raw, puckered tissue. It throbbed with a dull, heavy heat, stark contrast to the bone-deep cold still radiating from her core. Bennett, the mantis-like chief medical officer, was pacing. His mandibles clicked in a frantic, irregular staccato. The necrotic tissue on his digits is regenerating, Bennett whispered, staring at a handheld scanner as if it were a bomb. He sustained level 3 frostbite. The cell walls burst. By all known biological laws, I should be amputating his hands at the wrist, but his system is aggressively overriding the necrosis. The cellular division rate is terrifying. It's like a biological wildfire. We call it inflammation. Arthur croaked from the bed. His voice sounded like grinding gravel. He didn't open his eyes. It hurts like a son of an NBSP and NBSP. Give me the good painkillers, doc, not that synthetic garbage. I need the heavy stuff. Your liver is currently filtering lethal amounts of ammonia from your bloodstream. Bennett squawked, taking a step back. If I administer a standard class 4 analgesic, your respiratory system will fail. If you don't give me an analgesic, I'm going to rip this beam monitor out of the wall and beat you with it, Arthur muttered, coughing weakly. A thin line of blood trickled from his cracked lips. Cassidy watched him. He was a mess of damaged meat and fragile veins. Yet his body was fighting a war of attrition against the universe, and it was winning. On her home world, healing was a slow, deliberate process. A burn like the one on her hands would take months to calcify over with new, hardened tissue. It was a methodical reconstruction of armor. Arthur's healing was chaotic, it was sloppy, violent and highly inefficient, but it was incredibly fast. His body didn't care about structural perfection. It only cared about getting back to baseline function before something else tried to kill him. Treat his pain, Cassidy rumbled. Her voice was flat, but it carried a deep, resonant finality that made the medical equipment rattle on its trays. Bennett swallowed hard, his large black eyes darting between the massive, immovable Deathworlder and the scrawny, bleeding one. He hurried to a locked cabinet, his long digits shaking as he keyed in the override code. Cassidy looked back at her hands. Blisters were stretching taut. She flexed her fingers, the burnt skin cracked, sending a sharp spike of agony up her forearms. She didn't WSC. Pain was just data. It told her the structural limits of her current physical state. Arthur finally opened his eyes. They were completely bloodshot. The scara, a web of ruptured red vessels. He looked at her hands, then up at her face. "You're an idiot," he whispered. Shivering, "I secured the breach." Cassidy replied, "You grabbed a Sub-Zero pipe with bare hands," Arthur said, slowly pulling his right arm out from under the thermal blanket. The skin was covered in a thick layer of medical gel, his fingers wrapped in sterile gauze. "You could have permanently degraded the flexor tendons. You could have lost your grip." "I do not lose my grip," Arthur snorted, a brief cynical sound that immediately turned into a hacking cough. "Right, unbreakable." Forgot. He laid his head back against the thin, sterile pillow. "Thanks, Cass, for not letting me pop like a frozen balloon down there." "You welded the seam," Cassidy stated. It wasn't a compliment. It was an acknowledgement of a factual transaction. Your thermal tolerance was breached, yet you maintained fine motor control. Spite, Arthur said softly, his eyes sliding shut as Bennett finally injected a clear fluid into his IV line. "Pure, unadulterated human spite. We hate the cold." Within seconds, the tension bled out of Arthur's shoulders, the harsh, ragged rhythm of his breathing smoothed into a shallow, medicated draw. The painkillers hit his system, shutting down the screaming nerve endings. Cassidy sat in the quiet hum of the infirmary, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. He was asleep. He was completely vulnerable. Any standard predator on the station could walk in and crush his skull with a moderate application of force. But they wouldn't, because for the first time in 5 years, the solitary Deathworlder had decided she had something worth standing in front of. They were officially confined to quarters. Station administration had no protocol for what to do with two employees who had bypassed a lockdown, destroyed a primary blast door, and manually sealed a catastrophic core leak. Standard procedure dictated they be fired for insubordination and property damage. Survival instinct dictated that Rick's absolutely not try to fire the two beings capable of ripping his station apart with their bare hands. So they were placed on paid administrative evaluation. Cassid's quarters were in the deepest subble of the station, built directly over the artificial gravity generators. The room was sparse, A massive, reinforced steel slab served as a bed. There were no chairs, no fragile glass. Fixtures, no soft lighting. It was a concrete bunker designed to contain a localized earthquake. Arthur was sitting on the edge of the steel slab, his legs dangling. He was out of his medical wraps, though his hands were still heavily bandaged. He wore a fresh gray undershirt and his canvas jacket. Between them sat a battered metal thermos, so they're trying to figure out how to bill us for the blast door, Arthur said, twisting the cap off the thermos with his bandaged palms. He winced but forced it open. Rick sent an automated message. 600,000 credits for the pneumatic gears. You stripped. Cassidy sat on the concrete floor, her massive legs crossed. The air in her quarters was set to a heavy, comfortable 1.8 GS. It was the first time in days she didn't feel like she was going to float away. Arthur, however, looked visibly strained. His shoulders hunched under the increased gravity, his breathing slightly labored as his heart worked harder to pump blood to his brain. But he hadn't complained. He just leaned his elbows on his knees and endured it. I will not pay it, Cassidy said. The door was an obstacle to station preservation. Oh, neither am I, Arthur laughed, pouring a clear, noxious-smelling liquid from the thermos into the cap. He held it out to her. Here, drink. Cassidy took the small metal cap between her thick, blistered thumb and forefinger. She sniffed it. It smelled of industrial solvent and fermented grain. What is this? Engine degreaser, mostly, Arthur said, taking a pull directly from the thermos. He coughed, his eyes watering, and pounded his chest with a wrapped fist. Made it in Bay 4. Fermented hydro heat and synthesized ethanol. It tastes like battery acid, but it numbs the joints. Cassidy threw the liquid back. It hit her tongue like liquid fire, burning a path down her throat and settling as a heavy radioactive warmth in her stomach. It was awful. She handed the cap back. I approve. Arthur grinned, a crooked, tired expression. He poured himself another capful. You know, Arthur said, staring into the clear liquid, the galaxy looks at us like we're ticking time bombs. Rix looks at you and sees a wrecking ball. He looks at me and sees a liability that's somehow going to cause a lawsuit. Cassidy rested her heavy forearms on her knees. We are incompatible with their architecture. Yeah, but why? Arthur asked, looking up. Why are we out here? Earth is locked. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out without heavy clearance. We could have stayed home. We could have stayed where the gravity makes sense and the air doesn't smell like bleach. Cassidy thought about her home world. The crushing weight of the sky, the violent tectonic upheavals that required a society built on constant, unflinching vigilance. She snorts was strong because weakness meant immediate erasure. My world is solitary, Cassidy said slowly, words heavy and deliberate. We do not congregate. The land does not support density of population. We survive alone. I came here because the Rim offers employment for raw force. It is transactional. I break things, they pay me. Arthur nodded, taking a slow sip of the harsh alcohol. We congregate, Arthur said quietly. Humans, I mean, we pack ourselves into cities until we can't breathe. We fight each other constantly. But Earth actively tried to kill us every single day. Microbes, hurricanes, apex predators, snorts. We didn't have armor like you. We didn't have claws. We were soft little meat sacks running around the savannah. He looked at his bandaged hands, turning them over under the harsh overhead light. We survived because we figured out how to carry things together, Arthur continued. 1 human is dead meat. 2 humans with sharp sticks, that's a problem. 10 humans, that's an apex predator. We didn't survive by being the strongest. We survived because we refused to die alone. We dragged each other out of the mud. Cassidy listened to the subtle shift. His voice, the cynical mechanic, was gone, replaced by something much older and deeply worn. If your pack is your strength, Cassidy asked, her brow furrowing, why are you here alone? Arthur fell silent. He screwed the cap back onto the thermos. He stared at the concrete floor for a long time. The increased gravity in the room seemed to press down on him harder, pulling at the lines around his mouth, making him look frail. I had a crew, Arthur finally said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, a flat, dead tone that spoke of a heavily buried trauma, deep space salvage. 4 years ago we took a contract out in the Veil Nebula. Unstable asteroid field, the ship's inertial dampeners failed. He stopped. The silence in the heavy gravity room was absolute. Cassidy didn't push, she just watched his chest rise and fall against the canvas jacket. The hole breached, Arthur said, the words slipping out like ash. I was in the airlock prepping an EVA suit. The bulkhead sealed automatically. I watched them get sucked out, whole crew just gone. I sat in that airlock for 3 days before a passing freighter picked up the distress beacon. He looked up at Cassidy. His dark eyes were glassy, reflecting the harsh light. I couldn't go back to Earth, Arthur whispered. Too many people, too much noise. I came out here to the rim because nobody here knows how to be a pack. They're all too fragile. They don't touch each other. They don't rely on each other. It was easier to be surrounded by glass than to be surrounded by ghosts. Cassidy felt a profound, uncomfortable tightening in her chest. It wasn't a physical ailment. It was the sudden raw understanding of a different kind of survival. Her survival was physical. Arthur's survival was psychological. He was walking around with a shattered internal structure, holding it together through sheer stubbornness and cheap painkillers. Cassidy slowly reached out. She didn't move with her usual abrupt, heavy force. She moved deliberately, telegraphing her intent so as not to startle him. She placed her massive gray blistered hand on his shoulder. The weight of her hand pushed his shoulder down an inch. Arthur stiffened for a second, then exhaled a long, shuddering breath. He didn't pull away. You are not in the airlock anymore, Arthur, Cassidy rumbled, her voice vibrating through the floor and into his bones. Arthur looked at her hand. It was a weapon of mass destruction, currently resting gently on his collarbone. He let out a weak, cynical chuckle, wiping a stray drop of condensation from his eye with the back of his bandaged wrist. No, Arthur said, guess I'm not. He leaned into the weight of her hand, just a fraction. It was an anchoring force, solitary rock and a stubborn piece of soft dirt, finding Snort's equilibrium in a galaxy that wanted them both gone. Director Rix was sweating. It wasn't a physical impossibility for an avid species to sweat, but it required a level of biological stress usually reserved for outrunning predators. Currently, RX's iridescent blue feathers were plastered flat against his narrow skull and his black eyes darted nervously between the two data pads on his glass desk. Cassidy and Arthur stood before him. They had been summoned to Administration Level 3 at 800 hours. The air still smelled like synthetic lavender, but today it was violently overpowered by the smell of industrial degreaser and ozone radiating from the two Deathworlders. Cassidy stood tall, taking up the left side of the room. The plasma burns on her hands were wrapped in heavy black carbon weave. Arthur stood on the right. And GT snorts. And GT. He looked exhausted, leaning slightly to favor his bruised ribs, his hands still heavily bandaged. The Galactic Medical Board has reviewed the telemetry from the sublevel B incident. Rix chirped, his voice lacking its usual melodious cadence. It snorts was tight and strained. He tapped the left data pad. They have concluded that the structural integrity of the station would have suffered a 98.7% chance of total atomic vaporization had the primary coolant valves not been sealed. We are aware of the physics director, Arthur said dryly, popping a white pill into his mouth and chewing it without water. Rix winced at the sound. He tapped the right data pad. The station board of directors has also reviewed the security footage, the footage of you, Cassidy, bending a class, a reinforced steel conduit with your bare appendages, and you, Arthur, surviving an ambient temperature drop that shattered the surveillance drone's optical lenses. Rix leaned back, his thin talons gripping the edge of the glass desk. The board is terrified of you both, Rick stated bluntly. You are unregistered. Localized anomalies. You bypass 6 layers of security protocol. You destroyed a blast door worth a small fortune. You operate completely outside the bounds of civilized biological constraints. Get to the point, Rix. Cassidy rumbled. Are we terminated? Rix looked at the massive, immovable wall of muscle. He looked at the soft, bleeding biped who refused to die. If I terminate you, Rix said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, the station's insurance premiums will triple because we no longer have a redundancy measure against catastrophic structural failure. And I have 16 automated cargo lifters down in Bay 4 that the aquatic mechanics refuse to touch because the bolts are rusted shut. Arthur let out a slow, cynical laugh. You can't afford to fire us. I cannot, Rick admitted miserably, his feathers drooping. The fragile ecosystem of this station currently relies on the terrifying brute force of 2 walking hazard zones. The board has authorized a new classification for your employment. Rix pushed a physical paper document across the glass desk. It was an ancient, archaic way of sealing a high-level contract reserved only for extreme circumstances. You are no longer classified as dock laborers, Rix said. You are officially designated as the primary hazard maintenance team. You report directly to me. You bypass coal. You bypass standard safety protocols. You fix the things that are too heavy, too hot, too cold, or too dangerous for civilized species to look at. Arthur walked forward. He picked up the paper document with his bandaged fingers. He scanned the text, his dark eyes moving rapidly over the legalese. There's a catch, Arthur said, looking over the paper at Rix. What's the catch? You are restricted to sublevel C4. Your residential quarters, Rix said quickly. We are retrofitting a reinforced habitat Module heavy gravity plating. Reinforced steel bulkheads. It will cost me a fortune, but it will keep you isolated from the fragile population. During your off hours, Cassidy stepped forward, the deck plates groaning in protest. She looked down at Rick's director, physically shrank back into his chair. Subtle C is acceptable, Cassidy said. However, we require an increase in caloric stipends. I require raw protein. Arthur requires access to real agricultural imports, coffee, meat, not synthetic blocks. Rick swallowed hard. Agricultural imports are incredibly expensive. Vaporized stations are more expensive, Arthur pointed out casually, leaning against the glass desk. The glass creaked ominously. Rick flinched. Fine. Rick squawked, approved. Just please stop leaning on my desk and sign the document. Arthur pulled a battered pen from his jacket pocket. He signed his name with a messy, jagged scroll. He handed the pen to Cassidy. She took it gently, her massive bandaged fingers dwarfing the plastic tube, and carefully etched her name next to his. They turned and walked out of the office. The insectoid guards at the door immediately pressed themselves flat against the walls to let them pass. They stepped into the elevator tube. The door slid shut, cutting off the sterile smell of administration. Arthur leaned back against the curved metal wall, letting out a long breath. Hazard maintenance team, basically. They're paying us to be their attack dogs against failing infrastructure. It is a logical allocation of our biological traits, Cassidy said. Yeah, it is. Arthur looked over at her. Harsh elevator light cast long shadows over his bruised face, but the deep, exhausted cynicism that had clung to him for days seemed slightly lighter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the broken half of a white plastic stick, popping it into the corner of his mouth to chew on. Subtle C. Arthur mumbled around the stick. We're going to need to build a proper kitchen if I have to eat another synthetic block. I'm going to throw Rick's out an airlock. Cassidy looked at the soft, scarred, endlessly stubborn human beside her. He was weak, he was fragile, he leaked, he bled, and he complained endlessly. But he didn't break. I will require a heavy-duty thermal unit for cooking, Cassidy noted, and reinforced chairs. You destroy the standard ones. Deal. Arthur smiled. The elevator descended, plunging them back into the noisy, grinding heavy reality of the lower decks. They weren't heroes, they were just two heavy things in a galaxy made of glass. But as they walked out onto the docking bay floor, shoulder to shoulder, that glass didn't seem so intimidating anymore. They had their own gravity. Now, if you loved witnessing the raw, unbreakable grit of Cassidy and Arthur standing against a fragile galaxy, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe to HFY Cinema for more grounded, visceral tales of humanity, proving that being soft doesn't mean being weak. Share this with a fellow Deathworlder and tell us in the comments, would you rather have Cassid's absolute strength or Arthur's relentless spite? Stay stubborn and we'll catch you in the next transmission.